as you have taken it upon yourself to learn ancient Egyptian and Hebrew to the extent you know a lot of the words and can do some of your own interpretation quite easily. And it starts putting a different spin to the story. And speaking of spins to the story, can you set us up with an understanding of what the Pesher technique is? And then we're going to get into the juicy stuff.
Okay, well, the Pesher technique is just the interpretation of the text, assuming effectively that most of the texts are written as parables, and so there are deeper meanings within the text. I think sometimes it's easy to see too much into these texts, and so you have to be very careful about how deeply you take it. And I think some of the books that have been written have taken the Pesher technique rather too far. But I do use a sort of similar technique in that I'm retranslating effectively what the texts are actually saying. So just for an example, in the Bible it talks about Abraham having 318 servants, which might sound unusual because he was supposed to be a shepherd. You know, why would a shepherd have 318 servants? But if you look into Josephus, and I use Josephus or Josephus as they tend to say in America, if you look into his version of the same text, he clearly says that Abraham had 318 army officers. So a very small change, but then makes a very big change in the understanding of that particular text. What it means, of course, is that Abraham had an army of about 30,000 people. So he must have been very influential, very powerful. He must have been a king. Why were they called shepherds? Well, the reason I believe is because they were the shepherd kings. And there was a line of pharaohs within Egypt who are known as the Hyksos or the Hyksos, who were known as the shepherd kings. And that is where the term shepherd comes from. And so Abraham was not a shepherd. He had 318 army officers.
Meaning
so
a vast army.
A vast army of at least 30,000 people. So he was a shepherd king. And we know who the shepherd kings were. They were the Hyksos. And they were the people who controlled Lower Egypt. That's the northern half of Egypt. Egypt was quite traditionally, it was divided between north and south quite on a number of occasions. It wasn't always united. And so you had a southern pharaoh and a northern pharaoh. And during the Hyksos period, again, we had two pharaohs, and we had this line of shepherd kings in the north. And this is where I think the story comes from. And this is a presumption that goes back a long way. If you read Josephus and his history, now Josephus was around the 1st century AD, and he wrote a history of the Israelites, completely different. And so we have to look back through the text and sort of reinterpret the text, trying to see the original Egyptian historical evidence. Because the Bible as we see it has somehow become divorced totally from history. So here we have a book that is a complete history of these people, and yet none of these events, none of these people, nothing within the Bible can be found within the historical record.
Right,
which is very strange.
Yes.
It's as though the Bible happened on a different planet.
Right.
But it didn't. We know where it happened, roughly. So, and these people were important, whether it was Abraham, whether it was King David and King Solomon, who were supposed to be the most influential monarchs in that area, in that era, and yet they can't be found in the historical record. And so the question is, why?
And this is where the etymology comes into play.
Indeed.
So can you start giving us some, maybe a little bit more specific idea of what you're talking about in terms of who these players throughout biblical history may have been in secular history?
Yes, well, let's look at the United Monarchy, for instance. That's King David and King Solomon. As I said, they were hugely influential, very wealthy. Monarchs came from all over the region to pay them tribute. And yet they are missing in the historical record. They've done a lot of archaeology in Judea, in Jerusalem. And the conclusion of Finkelstein, who's one of the eminent archaeologists of that area, is that Jerusalem was no more than a village during this era. And of course he's found no evidence for King David and King Solomon, which is a bit of a problem. Because here we have this story about these famous kings, and they are not there. And so you've only got two options, really. Either, as some people maintain, it's all mythology, and this book was completely made up. And we don't know what happened to him, his royal family, Nefertiti, Kia, his other wife. All of the main players are not present. People say they died at Amarna, but there is no evidence for that. But Manetho seems to be clearly stating that they actually went on another exodus, a smaller exodus, up to Athens, and then maybe beyond. The story about Moses and his part in the Exodus. And what's happened in the Bible, of course, is they've taken these two Exodus events and they've combined them into one story, effectively. But I think it was two Exoduses, as Manetho states. And both of these Exoduses, of course, went up to the north because eventually these named priests and lepers were kicked out of Avarice as well.
And what do you think the named priests and lepers, 80,000
Well,
of them
this
said,
80,000 named priests.
actually were?
Well, Akhenaten, as we know, was the rebel pharaoh. So he was the pharaoh who tried to institute monotheism
Right.
within Egypt. So he was destroying the old gods and instituting his new god, the Atum. And of course, the biblical god is sometimes called the Ardun. And Atum went to Amarna, and about 12 years later, his old empire collapsed. And we don't know what happened to him, his royal family, Nefertiti, Kia, his other wife. All of the main players are not present. People say they died at Amarna, but there is no evidence for that. But Manetho seems to be clearly stating that they actually went on another exodus, a smaller exodus, up to Avarice, and then maybe beyond. Now, the strange thing is, the brother of Akhenaten was called Moses, Tutmosis. And so we seem to have the two brothers. In the Bible, they're called Aaron and Moses. And in history, they were called Akhenaten and Tutmosis. And here, I think, is where we bring in the story about Moses and his part in the Exodus. And what's happened in the Bible, of course, is they've taken these two Exodus events and they've combined them into one story, effectively. But I think it was two Exoduses, as Manetho states. And both of these Exoduses, of course, went up to the north because eventually these named priests and lepers were kicked out of Avarice as well.
And what do you think the named priests and lepers, 80,000
Well,
of them
this
said,
80,000 named priests.
actually were?
Well, Akhenaten, as we know, was the rebel pharaoh. So he was the pharaoh who tried to institute monotheism
Right.
within Egypt. So he was destroying the old gods and instituting his new god, the Atum. And of course, the biblical god is sometimes called the Ardun. So Ardun is the same god, obviously. Now, from the Theban priesthood's perspective, this would have been very heretical. And so Akhenaten would have been called the maimed priest and a leper. Not a real leper,
Meaning
of
an
course.
outcast.
An outcast, a theological leper,
Mm-hmm.
because his new sect was so different and so confrontational that it was destroying all the old traditions, all the old gods. And so yes, of course, he would be called the named priest and the theological
So this
leper.
would have been a group of religious rebels, essentially,
Effectively.
effectively by him.
Yes.